Back in the day, I made a video called I Love Hyrule Warriors. Just a short little video about why I loved the game so much, and why I was super excited for the then upcoming Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity. Don't bother watching it, it's trash. Fast forward to my top games of 2020 video and, well, it was one of the most disappointing games I've ever played. No joke. I kinda hated it for various reasons.
How asinine.
So after returning to the original game recently and rediscovering why I love it so much, I thought I'd put together a little video about what I'd like to see if they made a real successor to Hyrule Warriors. The good one. Hyrule Warriors 2. Feel free to join me and indulge in my closet Nintendo fanboyisms and fantasize about how they could make this a thing. I don't think they will ever do this, but, well, stranger things have happened. Also be aware that this video will obviously be littered with spoilers for the entire Zelda series, so proceed at your own discretion. Even though it's not really the biggest part of the original game's enjoyment, we still need a premise and story. The first Hyrule Warriors story is kind of ridiculous in my opinion. Really just boils down to a girl having a crush on Link and setting the world on fire as a result. But it's all the excuse we needed to be able to enjoy seeing some of our favorite characters from different timelines come together for one big chaotic war. Why the hell not? The sequel can do something similar and bring out other parts of the timelines we haven't seen in the main storyline yet, with the big focus being on a link to the past for the main catalyst of the story. Fitting name and all that, isn't it? So the Guardian of Time senses a disturbance in the timelines or something, and decides to send Link back in time to investigate. But when he gets there, he discovers his Triforce of Courage is suddenly gone, and he is surrounded by monsters. Begin the first mission. Link has to fight his way out and get to Hyrule Castle, while helping to save some of the people along the way. This would be a short level to basically act as a tutorial. At the end, as Link goes to Hyrule Castle, he is stopped by Vaati, who has somehow survived and escaped the Four Sword and is now in the timeline of A Link to the Past. You fight him for a while as an introductory boss fight, but he is too strong for Link without his Triforce. He is then taken away by the hordes of evil. A few moments later, we are introduced to Link, from the past timeline, who is sleeping as usual. He then goes out and takes the fight to the monsters, and right when he catches up to Vaati, he is stopped by a newly revived Aghanim. Vaati then uses the captured future Link's body as a catalyst to tear open a rift in time, and sends Aghanim to various places to gather more dark forces and power. Termina, Labrina, and Holodrum, the past Hyrule from Minish Cap, the future Hyrule from the Age of Calamity, and whenever the time period is when the Zonai created Hyrule. From there on out, that's when the game can continually have fun and throw references at us. Like I said before, it's not the main focus of the game, so it doesn't have to take itself seriously. You can even throw in another post-game mini-story involving Linkle again, where she goes back in time to the same era, but gets wrongly sent to the Dark World first or something. I don't know. I ain't no fanfiction writer, so you can fill in the blanks however you want. Here's the most important thing I'd want them to do, though. Use the template that Hyrule Warriors 1 used, including the game engine, because holy shit. Age of Calamity runs like ass. I don't care about graphics. It could have the same level of graphics as the first game for all I care, but if they were to make this a title for the Switch 2, there's many technical improvements that could be worked into the gameplay. For some reason, on the Switch version of Hyrule Warriors, enemies tend to despawn or just not really exist once they go off screen, which is really bizarre and annoying because they won't get hit by your attacks sometimes, but not only that, some characters' projectile attacks also despawn or just don't exist when they go off screen. With better hardware, something like this wouldn't need to happen to keep the performance up to par. That being 60 FPS, not 30, you console gremlin apologists. While they're at it, they really gotta fix the game's lock-on camera. Holy shit, what a disaster. Like, just make it not hard locked on the target and only move gradually instead, and give us a couple of zoom options. Simple, but what a difference it would make. But I think the one thing that would make the biggest difference this time around would be something very important that was one of the major complaints I had about the first game. For something you have to play for around 300 hours to unlock all the game's content, it got really repetitive because of the limited number of stages the game has that are recycled over and over for everything in the adventure mode. 16 stages, or 14 in the original version of the game, and you can subtract 1 from that if you consider Ganon's Tower and Hyrule Field as the same because, well, they kinda are. If it was up to me though, they would all be coming back and I would add to them, maybe give them some more open space, add a few more keeps and offshoot paths, maybe make some secrets with some Easter eggs tucked away, you never know. But here's what I got for the new stages. A Link to the Past would feature 2 stages due to being the spotlight for this game, and because of the obvious reason, Light World and Dark World. 2 maps with tons of different landmarks to bring to life, which is one of the most interesting things about the potential this game could have, taking some of the old 2D locations and bringing them to life in fully detailed 3D for the first time. Would be pretty awesome, don't you think? That includes Link's Awakening, Oracle of Seasons, Oracle of Ages, and Minish Cap, each of which would have their own dedicated stage featuring various locations from those games, with the latter having a variant with Dark Hyrule Castle. The Terminus stage would probably be the most interesting out of them all, and could utilize pretty much the entirety of Termina Field, with keeps in all 4 compass directions, while Clocktown has 4 keeps in the middle of the map, very close to each other, making it a perfect King of the Hill style of battlefield. Then we have the map for Breath of the Wild, which would be the largest stage in the game by far, utilizing the wide open Hyrule field from that game for battles on a larger scale than we've ever seen before in this series. Maybe some wild horses could be seen wandering around to give you a speedy lift if you need it. There would also be 2 stages from Tears of the Kingdom, one being a series of sky islands linked by Zonai transport devices, and the second being an underground stage, with the Spirit Temple and various other underground landmarks, and would require the use of light routes to be able to see clearly, or to stifle your enemy's vision and move speed. All of these stages would be awesome, but doesn't mean they have to stop there, as they could make some original stages based on the Hyrule Warriors' present universe, like a Lanayru region with Lake Hylia, Hebra region with snowy mountains, or a Lost Woods zone, or even a time dimension since there's all sorts of time travel and shit. Next we have the Returning Adventure mode, with all new maps that weren't featured in the first game. Remember how each one was recreated in the 8-bit style of the original Legend of Zelda? This would do the same thing, but since it's the sequel, every map would be recreated in the style of A Link to the Past. It was cool seeing them all in 8-bit, but I think this would be even cooler. For the maps themselves, I have a bunch listed based on the same difficulty levels as the first game had. For easy, we have A Link to the Past, Breath of the Wild, and Skyward Sword. For normal, we have Ocarina of Time, Oracle of Seasons, and Minish Cap. For hard, Oracle of Ages, and A Link to the Past Dark World. For hero difficulty, we have Zelda 2, Ocarina of Time Master Quest, and an original map based on the Hyrule we see in Hyrule Warriors 1. In addition, there would also be a Tears of the Kingdom map that features all 3 of that game's layers: Sky Islands, the Overworld, which would be like Breath of the Wild Master Quest mode, and the Underworld, which would scale in difficulty depending on where you are and requires unlocking all characters and weapons from other maps to complete. Plus, a new rewards map, of course. I don't know if I would bring back the Skulltula system for this one, as I wasn't really a big fan of that mechanic in the first game for various reasons, but if not, then we'd have to have something else take its place, or it could just only be used in some of the adventure maps like the Ocarina of Time ones. I don't know. This all sounds like a lot of content, and that's because it is. I'd expect not all of it would be there at launch because that's just the way things are now. Oh well. Another idea I had for a new mode, and I think this would be very fun, is something I call Hyrulean Conquest. Have you guys ever played Star Wars Battlefront 2? The original, not the EA one. If so, you might remember a mode called Galactic Conquest, where it was you against another fighting for control of the various planets throughout the system, with each planet having its own stage. This would be very similar to that, and it would use the Hyrule Warriors version of Hyrule that most of the stages are based on. And it would let you choose between the forces of the goddess or the forces of darkness, each vying for control of every part of the world, with key parts of the map being the key location to unlock and try to control the stages of each timeline. Once you're in control of every key location and timeline, it would allow you to take over the main base stage of your opponent, which would be the Hyrule Field and Castle stage for the heroes, or either the Valley of Seers or Ganon's Tower stage for the villains. This is just an idea of what kind of mode they could include, and this one in particular would give the game even more replayability, and could be interesting if versus multiplayer became a thing in this game somehow, but I don't know if that even works in this kind of game. Let me know in the comments if you think of any other modes they could include. Before we get into the character section, there's one more major upgrade I'd want to see. In the first game we have the 5 elements: light, dark, fire, water, and lightning. I'd like to expand this and add 3 more elements to give the game a bit more variety. The first would be forest, which encompasses plant-based attacks, obviously, with the element's special effect being able to root enemies to the ground for a brief period of time. The second is wind, which is kind of a glaring omission, as there are a lot of wind themes in the Zelda series. I would make its special effect similar to lightning's, but instead of just launching enemies like crazy, it pulls enemies towards you so it's easier to get juggle combos. The last new element is Earth, which has the effect of stunning enemies briefly and dealing more damage to stunned enemies. Additionally, I would also classify some characters as neutral if they utilize more than 2 elements in their attacks, such as Sheik or Ravio. Since they would be disqualified from getting an elemental stage boost, they would be buffed in other ways. Or in Sheik's case, maybe not, since she's so broken and doesn't need any buffs. Anyway, on to the new characters. I mentioned that a classic version of Link would appear in the story alongside the Hyrule Warriors Link, but that doesn't really mean he needs to be a separate character functionally, so he could just be a skin. But his weapon would be the Golden Sword or Magic Sword, and those magic spells that you can use in A Link to the Past would also be a part of his combos, which would be awesome. Since there's multiple spells of different elements, he could be classified as a neutral element if not light. The other Link to the Past character I mentioned being in the story is Aghanim, obviously a dark element playable villain, and since his old gimmick was shooting spells that Link could reflect back at him, enemies could do that with Aghanim's attacks, which would then allow you to reflect them again for a really strong and wide-ranged counterattack. Would be a pretty fun weapon to master. The last character I mentioned being in the story is Vati, who is another playable dark element villain, who would use his magic and various transformations as part of his combos. Now, there's plenty more characters I would love to add to the game, and this is just a quick rundown of all the ideas I had. Rounding out the 6 sages from Ocarina of Time, we have Saria and Nabooru. Saria would take over Lana's utterly dog-shit Deku Spear weapon from the first game, which would be changed to the forest element and improved in various ways, including some fairy magic attacks. Man, I hated that weapon, but it's certainly salvageable. Nabooru would use the earth element, using sand and spiritual attacks alongside her dual scimitars like the other Gerudo mini-bosses. From Majora's Mask, we have the character that I would want to see the most out of anybody, King Ikana. Oh man, this would be one of the most entertaining characters to use, having him attack with his 2 minions following your orders, and detaching your head to float around and bite enemies simultaneously. So much you could do with that character. It's a shame he wasn't in the game already. Next we have Din and Nayru from Oracle of Seasons and Ages. Din would be a fire element using the Rod of Seasons. This would play somewhat similar to Link's Fire Rod, which would make it seem kind of redundant, but I'll get to that later. But maybe since winter is one of the elements, it could have water as a secondary element. Nayru is kind of a tricky one, but I settled on having her being a water element ice magic character, using the harp to freeze time on certain enemies with her attacks. Would be kind of weird, but it could work. But also from the Oracle games, we have Onox, an earth element who would be an absolute brute of a character with his ball and chain weapon, and Varan, a dark element magic user who takes over the bodies of her enemies and uses them against everyone. All of these characters would be awesome to see in the game. Moving on, do you like boulders? Well, you could play as Darbus from Twilight Princess, and use his Chris Redfield boulder punching earth elemental style to just wreck shit. That could be fun, right? Also, the Hero Spirit, a light elemental undead being who uses some really advanced sword techniques to wreck the battlefield. Another character that would have been great to see with the Toon Link style alongside Toon Zelda's Phantom Armor is Burn from Spirit Tracks, who would use projectiles and his clawed gauntlet to grab and combo enemies with the wind element. Shame he didn't get a spot in the previous game. Another glaring omission was Demise, you know, the Demon King. As if using the dual swords with Ganondorf wasn't brutal enough, this could be even more destructive and utilize both dark and lightning elements. Also, we all know Groose should be in there too. I don't remember much of what he can do, so I don't know how he'd play, but do it anyway. Now I know there's a Hilda skin for Zelda, but I think she should have been her own character too. Since she's the inverse of Zelda, she would use dark element shadowy magic with her staff. Now, I know I said I hated Age of Calamity, but even I will admit there were some things that weren't all that bad. The way the characters played was very salvageable and could be brought into this game as well, with all 4 champions making an appearance in the story. They would effectively play similar to how they do in Age of Calamity, with Revali being a wind element, Daruk fire, Mipha water, and Urbosa lightning. And from Tears of the Kingdom, we could add Rauru, who would use the light element with various Ultra Hand abilities and contraptions for his combos. Also, Mineru could appear with her construct, and she would be classified as a neutral element, since her construct can swap between a wide array of weapons and abilities with various elements. In addition to all this, I would want to add at least one more character, who seems to be the fan favorite of the present-day champions, Sidon, as a bonus character. At least one. But there's 2 more characters I had on the list that would be interesting to use, but with a caveat. The first is Twin Rova from Ocarina of Time, who would be a dual fire and water element, and would be able to act separately or fuse together for different fighting styles. Lastly, Adolwa from Majora's Mask, who would use wild frenzied attacks with his saber alongside summoning insects that utilize the forest element. Both of these last two characters could be featured as playable, or as bosses, which is why I wanted to save them for last, and I'll talk a bit more about bosses later on. I have some ideas for more weapons, but I also want to point out that in the definitive edition of Hyrule Warriors, you'll sometimes see characters use weapons of other characters, such as Sheik using Zelda's rapier on certain adventure mode maps. So what's stopping them from letting us do that too? Since some characters only have access to one weapon while others have more, it would make for a bit less repetition of using the same characters like Link over and over. Like from what I have written down, many of the weapons I have listed could be used by more than one character, including many of the ones I just mentioned for new characters. Like since I gave the Deku Spear to Saria, I'd still have Lana be able to use it, and since Din's Rod of Seasons makes the Fire Rod kind of redundant, Link would be able to use that instead alongside Din. There's also a few weapons I'd change the elements of, such as Zelda's Wind Waker having the wind element of course, Sheik's harp being neutral, Agatha having wind as a secondary element instead of lightning since lightning doesn't really help her at all, and of course there's so many ways we could buff or improve certain characters' weapons, but we'd be here all day. I mentioned Link would have a magic sword and spells option from A Link to the Past already, but he could also have another option, which is the Ocarina of Time Giant's Knife, plus his magic arrows and spells from Ocarina of Time. Might seem redundant since Impa uses that, but I don't care. Give him a two-hander, damn it. But that's all I got for Link, he's got enough already. For young Link, however, he could also use his own Ocarina of Time weapon and item set, which would allow him to have a forest element-inspired moveset. He could also use two more styles from Majora's Mask, the first being a neutral multi-element style based on his various transformations from Majora's Mask worked into his combos, including the Giant's Mask for his special attack. That would be nice. If they don't give the main Link a two-hander, the second could be another heavy magic style using the Great Fairy Sword, also with magic arrows, and maybe the Emptiness statues from Stone Tower? Gotta get Ben into the game somehow after all. For Toon Link, he's gotta be able to use the Four Sword, I mean come on. Having four little Links hacking and slashing away in unison in this game would be awesome. Another could be a style inspired by Triforce Heroes, but I still haven't played it yet, so I don't know how it would work. For Ganondorf, give him a style based on his Twilight powers in Twilight Princess, including the Sage's Sword, which would be a unique neutral with light and dark elements in the same style. While they're at it, give him his dual swords from Wind Waker because why not? Might look weird in this game, but that's okay. He could also have another style inspired by Phantom Ganon in Ocarina of Time. They'd have to take some liberties, but that's also okay. And of course, his Dark Katana style from Tears of the Kingdom could also be in there. For Impa and Sheik, I have two styles that could be interchangeable between the both of them. The first being Shadow Sage arts based on Impa's Ocarina of Time abilities, which aren't exactly all that visible in-game, mainly just implied, but hey, like I said, taking liberties is okay sometimes. The other style would be to import Impa's Age of Calamity moveset, which was probably my favorite to use in that game, so yeah. Lastly, they could also give Lana and Sia a Guardian of Time ability that's usable by the both of them. If you know the story of the first game, you know. There's a couple weapons I'd consider cutting out entirely. I mentioned the Fire Rod earlier because it would be redundant, but I would also get rid of Link's horse too. Not just because that weapon was just awkward to use, but I would make horses a separate mechanic usable by all characters. Since some of the maps would be a lot bigger than the previous games, there would be horses in various keeps that allow you to move yourself from one keep to another quickly. Also in the Breath of the Wild map, there would be horses roaming around the large field too. The other one I had on the chopping block was the Great Fairy because, well, it kinda sucks. And there would be more Great Fairy appearances across the other timelines, and it doesn't really work with some of the additional mechanics I had in mind, like the horses. Imagine that giant trying to ride the horse. But speaking of additional mechanics, there are a few new items to go along the bombs, bow, boomerang, hookshot, and hammer. Yes, another main reason the Fire Rod would have been redundant is that the Fire Rod would now be its own item, usable by any character, and would work against some of the new bosses I had in mind. Alongside that, there would also be an Ice Rod, so you'd have both like in A Link to the Past. Another item would be the Mystery Seeds from the Oracle games, which can be shot at enemies to have random effects, like any elemental affliction or turning them into a cuckoo, at least for the mobs. Also the Lens of Truth, which can be used to find hidden treasures and reveal invisible or ghostly enemies. Lastly, I would import the shield parry mechanic from the modern Zelda games as well, which works for certain projectiles and bosses. But there would also be a mirror shield pickup that makes parrying easier and allows reflection of certain attacks, like Twin Rovas. Now, speaking of which, let's talk about some more bosses. I mentioned Twinrova already, as well as Adolwa, but there would be a lot more that they could use, and let's be honest, the boss fights in Hyrule Warriors were honestly kind of lame, with maybe the exception of Phantom Ganon, but even he had his share of issues, like sometimes just standing around and forcing you to wait for a random amount of time before using his attack that exposes his weak point, when you're ranked partially based on time. Like, come on. Maybe give them some more quick moves to use in between, or give us a way to force them out of their idleness more frequently. There were two types of bosses in the first game, the usual ones that required you to use a certain item to expose their weak point, like the Dodongo or Goma, or the other two that just tested your ability to hit them in a certain way, the Imprisoned and Phantom Ganon. For the latter, I have a bit more than that, so this game would require you to get your combat skills up to snuff more than before. Especially because one of them would be the final boss, Ganon. The old school style of Ganon from A Link to the Past. Boomerang tridents, crazy magic, smug porky expressions and all. Another one that would really test your mettle is one of the main story bosses, Onox, who turns into a giant dragon as his final form. Also, like I mentioned earlier, if Adolwa isn't a playable character, he would be one of these types of bosses as well. Or you know what, fuck it, make him playable and a boss, as well as Twinrova, why the hell not? The rest of the combat bosses I have written down are Moldorm, that annoying worm shite that knocks you off the arena. Yeah, that one. Captain Kita from Majora's Mask, Iron Knuckles, that derpy dragon thing Aquamentus. He knocks either in the old school style or Breath of the Wild style. And of course, the Lionel, who could also have an old school skin. For bosses that require items to defeat, we have two big ones. The first being Death-Eye the Nightmare from A Link to the Past, who takes on various forms for certain attacks and can be forced into using his true form, which would then require the bow and arrow to knock out. The other main big boss of this style would be Varan. She would take over the bodies of your allies and you have to expose her by using the Lens of Truth and then hitting her with a Mystery Seed. Or just use the seed if you feel lucky. We also have Mothula and the giant Choo-Choo, whose weaknesses are the fire and ice rods respectively, as well as Twinrova and Trinex from A Link to the Past, who would both require the fire and ice rods to defeat. The Death Sword was a really cool mini-boss from Twilight Princess. He could be used as a boss that requires the Lens of Truth. I also have two bosses that require you to use the shield parry mechanic, one being a giant Octorok, or Big Octo.
Oh boy!
And the other being the obvious choice, the Guardian from Breath of the Wild. Lastly, I have two bosses from Tears of the Kingdom that I would have make an appearance. The first being the Queen Gibdo, and the second being the Gleeok. These two bosses have multiple weaknesses in their games, but if I had to narrow it down to one item, the Queen Gibdo would be weak to the Fire Rod and the Gleeok the Ice Rod. For the Gleeok, they could stick to using the flame version for the game, or they could do something weird and use the old school Gleeok style instead. Also, if we cut the Great Fairy out as a weapon, she could be a boss instead when you're fighting as the villains, I guess. One thing I was considering axing from the original game is Ganon's Fury, because that mode really sucks, to be honest. It's cool as a novelty mode, but actually playing it is really fucking boring in my opinion. If they were to choose not to axe it, one interesting thing they could do is expand the mode so that you could choose from multiple different bosses, like old school Ganon especially, but also Death-Eye, Dragon Onox, Demon Varan, Kita, Adolwa, if he's only a boss, or even a Lionel. Or maybe you'd rather control the giant Choo-Choo. I know I would. Or hell, they could just make it for all the different forms of Ganon. That's everything I have for the bosses. I would definitely make sure to make them attack on a much more frequent basis when you're fighting them, so you're not just standing around waiting for them to do something like in the original game. It would make these fights more challenging and somewhat more exciting at least, right? Speaking of more exciting, how about the mobs and captains? Yeah, there's quite a few things they could use for these types of enemies that aren't already in the game. Like, even the Hylian soldiers could get a little facelift and maybe look different depending on what region you're fighting in. Like those goofy mustache dudes from Ocarina of Time. Also, Dark Soldiers. You know, those basic enemies in A Link to the Past that you fight all the time, including the ball and chain guy as a captain. The Garo and Garo Master could make an appearance as well. Zoras and Gerudo appear as mobs in Age of Calamity, so they could also make an appearance, and they could even use those evil Zoras as well. For the old school enemies, they could even use Vyre and Wizrobes as captains, and of course, those little blob dudes, Zols. Splatting a ton of those at once would be a fairly amusing sight, just saying. There's also those silly trap enemies to consider, like the Deku Babas and Beamos that are killable with items. Bubbles, Keys, Dead Hand, Likes, Wall Masters, there's so many things they could add to this game. It's kind of insane to think about, but I think I will stop there because that's the end of my notes and this video is long enough already. Like with my Dragon Quest Builders 2 videos, I don't expect this to go anywhere, and I don't expect a real Hyrule Warriors 2 to ever happen because Nintendo seems to really want to forget the old Zelda games exist and just erase them from the lore's history, which really makes me not look forward to whatever comes next. But hey, this video was mostly just for fun. I still kinda want to make that Hyrule Warriors tier list video, but I don't know, I'm probably too late to the party on that one. Leave a comment if you think I should make it anyway, or if you have any of your own ideas that could be included in this series, or if you have any other ideas on what kind of video I should make next. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more incoherent rambling nonsense from me, hit the like button with your... or hit the dislike button if you're a salty Deku Spear main. You can catch me on random live streams as well, such as one sometime after this video goes up where I suffer through the last missions and Ganon's Fury. Or my weekly Monday Night Smashers streams at 3 PM Pacific, 6 PM Eastern where you can watch me suffer at the hands of other players. Don't forget to check out some of the other videos I've done, such as the What I'd Like to See from Dragon Quest Builders 3, which is looking more and more like a game that will never happen at this rate. Sad. Or maybe check out my top 10 favorite and least favorite JRPG protagonists and antagonists. You can also follow me on the X Twitter even though I post literally nothing, or catch my content on Rumble or Odyssey. And as always with this highly forsaken timeline, remember to put down the hopium and have high standards, low expectations.